best way to start this would be to tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to talk about one specific contemporary issue. I do a lot of stuff with bioethics and business ethics. That stuff's all in, there's a lot of stuff written on that you can read. What I'd rather talk about, which I think is more interesting, and I hope will be more fun for us to do in these two chapels, has to do more with how we think about morality today and how our culture addresses issues of right and wrong. And so the goal for this would be to give you some tools to talk to people in the culture, to talk to your non-Christian friends or your neighbors about issues that have to do with morality and more how they think about right and wrong. What I've discovered over the years of thinking about this is that once you get into this general topic, there's a lot of interest, and there are some really natural ways that leads to deeper discussions about spiritual things, about God, and particularly about the gospel. And so I want to sort of move us in that direction. It'll probably take us till Wednesday to get all the way there. But this is more not about what to do with certain issues, but it's more about how we think about some of the issues of the day. So today I want to do two specific things. One is I want to say a little bit about a general description of what a lot of people have pointed out already. So I don't think this is exactly breaking news, but about a general sense of moral decline in our culture today and sort of what that looks like. And there are some really controversial moral issues that people use as evidence of a general moral decline in our culture. I'm not going to talk about those. We're not going to say anything about abortion or same-sex marriage or anything like that. What I want to start with are some areas that I think are really clear places that indicate a decline in character and virtue in our culture that has most thoughtful people concerned. Okay? Now, just to start with this, about 6 months ago, this summer, I lost one of my heroes. Chuck Colson went home to be with the Lord in June of this year. Chuck was, as you may know, one of the great Christian statesmen of our time. And he is the founder of Prison Fellowship, which has had an incredible impact in the prison system and the lives of inmates all over the world. I got a chance to know Chuck a bit in the last couple of years working on a film project with him on ethics called Doing the Right Thing. And when as he would describe his discussions with people on ethics, he had a way of initiating a conversation on ethics with virtually anybody who he met off the street. He would say real simply, what do you think caused the financial crisis that we've experienced over the last few years? And then we get into all sorts of discussion about what the causes were. Inevitably, it came down to a discussion about ethics. And as to put it, we could summarize it like this. One economist made the point perfectly for Chuck when he said this: at every level in the financial world, they were deceiving the people they dealt with. At the heart of this financial crisis is an unethical series of acts. At the heart, at every level, there were ethical failures. Okay? Now, Wall Street is not the only place where there are questions about a decline of character and virtue. There are lots of other places as well, and these are areas, I'll just point these out briefly, where there's a lot of people have a lot of concern about this. For example, it's been well documented that in middle schools and high schools all over the country, cheating is at epidemic proportions. Okay? Now, I don't say this because the end of the semester is coming close and you might be tempted in that regard. But if you are tempted, don't. But particularly where this has been well documented is in high schools, particularly with the rise of standardized tests that I'm sure many of you took. There have been a number of really well-publicized cases all over the country where teachers actually have been in cahoots with students to help them cheat on standardized tests so that both the student and the teacher and the school all look good together. You think there's something not quite right with that picture. So, in addition, lying is much more common than it's ever been before. Some of the most high-profile legal cases, take Martha Stewart, for example, have revolved more around the cover-ups and the deception than the alleged crimes. For example, James Stewart, in his book on lying under oath, puts it like this, that mounting evidence suggests that broad public commitment to telling the truth under oath, mind you, when people are legally required to tell the truth, has been breaking down, a trend that's been accelerating in recent years. Further, many of the most publicized scandals in business and in the marketplace have revolved around truth-telling when it comes to financial affairs and accounting documents. Along with cheating and lying comes theft. Shoplifting and retail theft is another item that has reached epidemic proportions. There's now an entire industry that serves retailers seeking to alleviate the rampant theft that occurs on their premises. The FBI estimates that theft costs retailers roughly $30 billion, with a B, dollars every year. Other examples of moral decline in our culture include the rampant drug use, which has led increasing numbers of influential people in our culture to suggest that the war on drugs is a dismal failure and ought to be abandoned. Pornography today is virtually everywhere, available at the click of a mouse. In fact, the most recent studies tell us that the vast majority, now over around 60% of all internet traffic today, is devoted to pornography. With this has become what I would consider one of the most insidious trends, which is the increasing sexualization of young girls that's occurring in our culture. Today, the period between childhood and adolescence for many young girls is being increasingly shrunk and in some cases lost. Not surprisingly, there are massive increases in sexual assault and sexual abuse of children, and there are dramatic increases in human trafficking and sexual slavery around the world today. In fact, there are more people enslaved today around the world than there have ever been at any time in human history. Are you aware of that? More people in slavery today. Perhaps the most dramatic evidence of moral decline comes in the rise of the prison population. Chuck Colson, for example, reports that when he started working with prison fellowship in the late 1970s, there were roughly 220,000 people in prison. Today, roughly 30-some years later, there are 2.3 million people in prison today. Colson summarizes the current moral landscape in our country like this. He said, it's an inescapable consequence of neglecting moral training. We're all paying the price and pointing fingers at other people when the real problem is all of us aren't addressing the need for character formation and virtue in our lives today. Now, I think part of the reason that Colson describes as an ethical mess that we're in today has more to do, I think, with how we think about right and wrong generally in our culture today. It's very interesting when somebody makes a statement about something being right or wrong. It's very interesting to pursue that a little further with them and ask them, well, where exactly does right and wrong come from? How exactly do you come up with the idea that what you're saying is right or wrong? In fact, on the one hand, most people want to believe that there are some things that are just flat, plain wrong, like racial discrimination, sexual assault, human trafficking, things like that. But on the other hand, all of the polls that are taken in our country on these subjects suggest that at some level, people claim to believe in what we've commonly called today as relativism, the denial that there's any such thing as moral truth, and that when it comes to areas of right and wrong, all we have is feelings, emotions, and opinions. Now think about think about the implications of that. We want it both ways when we come to think about right and wrong. Some things are obviously wrong, but yet we also want to be able to make up our own moral rules for ourselves. What I would suggest to you is that our way of thinking about right and wrong is incoherent today. And this is one of the reasons why we have such a difficult time in our culture today thinking about morality in sound and clear terms. So let me give you a handful of examples that I think illustrate this general incoherence in the way people think about right and wrong in our culture. Here's the first. And this is by the statement, well, who gives you the right to judge? Often, when people make a moral assessment, that's the response you get. My good friend and Baylor University philosophy professor Frank Beckwith had a really interesting encounter on this one time. He was sitting on a panel, and the discussion was about the ethics and the legality of pornography. And he made the statement right up front, he's a Christian, and made the statement right up front that he thinks that pornography is immoral, it's morally wrong, and we should have restrictions on it. And it was very straightforward, very upfront about it. He said, I just think anybody who views pornography is doing something morally wrong. Well, he was assaulted by the other people on the panel who basically said, well, who gives you the right to judge? And it was stated more as a statement rather than a question, but he took it as a question. And he started to answer it. It was really interesting how he answered it. He said, well, I think I'm actually very qualified to judge. I've got a master's and a doctorate in this field. I've written several books on the subject. I've lectured on this around the world and have generally given it a great deal of very careful thought. I actually think I'm very qualified. And you could see the wheels spinning with the other members, that they didn't know quite what to make of this. And let's just say the other people on the panel were not all that impressed with his qualifications. But it became really clear that the point that they were trying to make was that no one had the right to make judgments like that. And what was so interesting about that is the irony of that went right over their heads, because what they didn't realize is that they were making a moral judgment on Dr. Beckwith for being narrow-minded and judgmental, while at the same time insisting that no one had the right to make these kinds of judgments in the first place. And Frank, in his own sort of unique way, had a very penetrating way of pointing that out. When people say, what gives you the right to judge, what they really mean is that no one should make a moral judgment on another person. The incoherence of this becomes really evident when people try to live this way. And what we find out is usually people will give this up in a heartbeat once they are the victim of some sort of injustice. When people are the victim of an injustice, they are not only willing to judge, but they are normally insistent on making a judgment that they have been wronged and that somebody has done something terribly wrong to them. Okay? Here's a second way that this incoherency is sometimes comes out, where people in our culture will say, well, when it comes to matters of right and wrong, follow your own conscience. Okay? This is what I call the Jiminy Cricket view of morality, that let your conscience be your guide. I've always found this ironic. If you remember the Disney movie Pinocchio that I suspect you saw as a child, you'll remember that before Pinocchio goes out to face the world, his friend Jiminy Cricket advises him to let his conscience be his guide. Ironically, after getting that advice, you remember Pinocchio gets into all sorts of trouble, suggesting that his conscience was really a lousy guide. A friend of mine who went to business school who commented on this. He puts it like this. In business school, when we had discussions on ethics, they said, well, what's ethics? They said, well, ethics is following your own integrity or following your conscience. And my friend said, but what if you have a poorly formed conscience? He said, what if you're a jerk? Or to take it further, what if you have no conscience at all? As is the case with the sociopaths and people like that who feel absolutely nothing when they commit horrible crimes. See, this view is also incoherent because a person following his or her conscience, you may be just fine until their conscience allows for an injustice against someone else. If you are that person who has been wronged or who has had an injustice put onto you, you tend to give up that notion that your conscience should be your guide really quickly. Now, here's a third. Values are what you value. Now, this is a very subjective view of morality. We'll talk about this a little bit more on Wednesday. But another expression of the moral relativism of our day. My friend who teaches history at a Connecticut university tells about what happened one day when his daughter received this advice in one of her high school classes. He puts it like this: my daughter Elizabeth was in high school at one point. She had a class on, well, I suppose the closest thing it would be to ethics. They said the definition of the word values is whatever you value. That's what values are, whatever you value. So she came home and said, okay, Dad, so if I value good grades better than honesty, it's okay for me to cheat? She got it immediately. It's incoherent. Now here's a fourth. This is, I think, one of the most common ways of expressing the moral landscape of our culture. And that is that we make up our own moral rules for ourselves. See, this is, I think, a very common way of expressing the relativism of our day. Either cultures make up their own moral rules, which we call cultural relativism, or individuals make up their own moral rules for themselves. We call this sometimes moral subjectivism, where morality is basically determined by a person's personal tastes and preferences. You hear this really frequently when sexual morality is discussed, and in matters of marriage and family, too. I heard this some time ago. I was speaking to a group of high school students just down, I think it was in La Habra or Whittier, on morality and ethics and relativism. And I asked them, sort of point blank, where do you get your idea of right and wrong? And a number of them said really clearly, well, we make up our own moral rules for ourselves. And there was I don't know, she must have been a junior or senior girl sitting right in the front row who was the most vociferous about this. And I basically said, I don't want anybody telling me what to do morally. I'm capable of making up my own moral rules, finding my own moral way myself. Well, just as it just so happened, she had a brand new iPhone sitting on her desk, right? And so I sort of walked over, and I just real casually picked up her iPhone and put it in my pocket. And just sort of went on with what I was talking about. And, I think she figured that it was sort of part of what I was doing, and there was a method to that. But when I was finished, I just got ready, gathered up my stuff and walked out. I still had her phone in my pocket. And she started to get a little bit concerned. In fact, she started to think really hard, like this might not be a joke. And so she said, well, can I have my phone back? And I said, no, I'm keeping it. And she said, but, huh? And I said, I thought you said that we all make up our own moral rules for ourselves. I said, my moral rules are that adults who are older and wiser are entitled to the stuff of students who are younger and inexperienced. And I don't think she'd ever thought about that. And even though I just made up that moral rule for myself at that very moment, she was completely flummoxed by what to say. She just sort of stammered and said, but that's not fair. She said, that's wrong. You're stealing my phone. At which point I had just a wonderful 30 seconds of pointing out to her the incoherency of her view of morality and how quickly she abandoned it and became a thoroughgoing moral absolutist when an injustice was done to her. She recognized that some things, like stealing someone's phone, are just plain wrong. And I tried to make the point that you can't have it both ways. You can't claim that we make up our own moral rules for ourselves and then give up that view when you're the victim of an injustice. My friend, Dr. Beckwith, who I mentioned a little bit earlier, had a teachable moment for one of his students when he was confronted by a view very similar to this. The student submitted a philosophy paper defending moral relativism. And in Dr. Beckwith's view, it was really well done, clearly deserved an A grade. And so he wrote at the end of the paper, "Great paper, well argued, clear and cogent, F." And the student, predictably, went absolutely ballistic when he got the paper back. At which point, Dr. Beckwith indicated that he was actually giving up the view that he had worked so hard to defend in his paper when he was confronted with a clear injustice against him. Now, my friend Chuck Colson also talked about the incoherency of relativism when he gave a very provocative lecture on ethics at Harvard Business School. You can actually get this lecture online from the Prison Fellowship Colson Center website. It's really worth having. He described it like this. He said, 20 years ago, a friend of mine gave $5 million to Harvard Business School to set up a chair on ethics. I called him and said, "You're wasting your money because as an institution, Harvard can't possibly teach ethics. Ethics are based on standards of right and wrong." So I wrote an article about it, after which he told me he thought I was wrong, got a lot of publicity. In fact, I got a lot of flack from friends of mine at Harvard. I ended up getting invited to give a distinguished lecture at Harvard Business School entitled, "Why Harvard Can't Teach Ethics." The room was packed. Students, faculty. I prepared harder for that than any talk I've given in years because I knew I was going to be assaulted by the best and the brightest. When I got all the way through the 45-minute talk and opened it up for questions, there wasn't one good question. It was very disappointing because there was just no engagement. I gave the same lecture at Yale and at my own alma mater of Brown University and had a similar experience. Colson argues that what passed for ethics education at Harvard Business School was pragmatism and what was good for business, but not ethics. Because morality depends on standards that are outside of human beings. Imagine your own moral compass, what a reliable guide that would be if it was always pointing at you. If you used a compass like that, you'd never get out of the woods. An adequate moral compass requires a reference point outside of ourselves. And this is where I think ultimately we get an opportunity to say something to our culture, not only about virtue and character, which we ought to be affirming for its own sake, but also about how this leads to deeper discussions of spiritual things and how ultimately this takes us to God and to the gospel. See, it seems really clear that if there is such a thing as a moral law, some sort of moral standards, which we'll talk a little bit more about that on Wednesday, that implies really strongly that there's someone who issued them and who cares very deeply about seeing that they're followed. And ultimately, I think that brings us not only to God, but to the gospel message about being rightly related to Christ. And that yes, I think it is possible for a non-believer to be good, but never to be good enough to earn or merit any kind of consideration before God. Now, the other thing, I think this creates an opportunity for us. The fact that the way our culture views this is so skewed and incoherent really gives an opportunity for us not only to provide some answers to the way people talk about morality, but also to ensure that the way we live demonstrates our commitment to doing what's right, demonstrates our commitment to our own personal integrity. See, it seems to me that we have a golden opportunity for a very sharp contrast with our culture, not only in the way we think, but in the way we live. But I want to be careful that we don't undermine this opportunity that we have by living in ways that are virtually indistinguishable from the culture. This is one of the things that's so troubling about where we're headed, that, for example, the incidence of abortion in the Christian community is not all that different than in the general culture at large. And the incidence of breakdowns in the family and marriage is not all that different in the Christian community than in the culture at large. And by being indistinguishable from our surrounding culture, we run the risk of losing a golden opportunity, not only to have a contrast in how we live, but also to have an entree with how we think and how we talk about issues that have to do with right and wrong.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.